have no fear, because the great wealth transfer is finally here.
This is a setup, a warning of the ugliness to come. Quote, "The greatest wealth transfer in history is here with familiar, rich winners," end quote.
So here's how the rich get richer, magic trick style. So let's take this wallet and this ordinary dollar coin. I'm gonna put it inside the wallet, which represents maybe something like a Roth IRA, which gives you certain tax advantages. And you know how they say that time will pass in the blink of an eye? Well, that's also true for investing. And that's how you can turn this dollar coin into a $100 bill, just like that. Now, you know what the rich like even more than the great wealth transfer? Making taxes disappear. So let's try that again. We're gonna take that same $100 bill and we're gonna fold it and put it back inside the wallet, which this time represents a small commercial bank, preferably one that won't collapse under a bank run. And just like that, by borrowing against our assets, we can make our taxes virtually disappear. Come on, that's not bad. Smash the like button, because that's the great wealth transfer explained, magic style. On a more serious note though, back in 1989, the grand total family wealth across the entire country was about $38 trillion when adjusted for inflation. But fast forward to 2022 and that total wealth has more than tripled to $140 trillion. And now the youngest of the 73 million baby boomers, that's people born between 1946 and 1964, are turning 60, the oldest of which are turning 80, and they are set to pass on their wealth to their children, some of which will pass on a lot of money, others of which will pass on less, and some of which will pass on the tales of Beetle the Bard, the Golden Snitch, the Deluminator, and Godric's Sword of Gryffindor. Unfortunately, it was never theirs to give away, and for the rest of us, there's a YouTube video, so let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well, come for the finance, and stay for the magic of data. Did you know that roughly half of all the wealth that's in the US is actually controlled by just one generation of people? The baby boomers. And that's because they got some of their money from the wealth transfer from their parents, the silent generation. That's why they hold only about $18 trillion worth of assets, while baby boomers have the majority at $78 trillion. And their children, whose Gen X holds $48 trillion, and their children, who are millennials, own only $14 trillion, or about 10% of all the wealth. And now, a lot of that money is about to be shuffled around cardistry style, and millennials will hopefully create a ladder where they can climb to the top and enjoy a better life. That also explains nothing at all, but studies show that showing people visual examples helps with retention time, which increases watch time, which ultimately means videos get more views, so I do. Data. Unfortunately, data also shows that today, it's the top 10% of the wealthiest people that control more than half of all the wealth. Just check this out. This chart represents all the wealth growth across the decades with the different tiers of how much is controlled by who. And you can see that the top 1% control almost as much of the wealth as the top 10. But combined together, the top 10% controls over half of all the wealth in the US. So the question, of course, is how did that exactly happen? So the reason that the top 10% of people control most of the wealth here in the US is because of a couple factors, and the first one is because of incomes. The top 10% of earners, for example, were averaging about $426,000 a year in 2022, while the bottom 50% was earning only $27,000 a year. That obviously makes for a huge difference in being able to save money to start investing and accumulating those assets. But reason number two is because of real estate. Now, if you were lucky enough to be born to a middle-class family here in the US that was in a position to buy a house somewhere around 1983, you would have made a lot of money. And you didn't have to be a particularly good house picker, because the average home here in the US grew by 500% since that time frame, from $86,000 in 1983 to $516,000 in 2023. As long as your family was in a position to buy and own a house, then you would have enjoyed massive gains in housing and therefore your net worth. But reason number three is because of the stock market. In 1976, John Bogle created the first index fund that would represent the top 500 companies in the US. That mutual fund, which is where most of my stock portfolio is held, became the golden standard of investing. And if you got into it around 1983, your portfolio would have grown roughly 2,800%, which is insane. Now, that doesn't even include dividends. To be fair, that also doesn't include inflation. But inflation, as far as the consumer price index goes, was up only 400% by that same time frame. So Whether you got into investing through housing or through the stock market, your investments would have way outpaced inflation and then some. Now, not surprisingly, it's also the top 10% of the wealthiest people that stand to inherit the majority of all this wealth in the coming decades.
The United States is facing an intergenerational transfer of wealth, the likes of which we've never seen before. The wealthiest 10% of households will be giving and receiving a majority of the riches. Within that range, the top 1%, which hold about as much wealth as the bottom 90%, will dictate the broadest share of the money flow. The more diverse bottom 50% of households will account for only 8% of the transfers.
That's right, but what's crazier still is that it's the ultra high net worth people, meaning anyone with $20 million in liquid assets or more, which represents only about 1.5% of US households, they will inherit almost most of it. In fact, they'll inherit 42% of all the transfers for the next 20 or so years. And this is partially made possible by the US tax code, which is about to blow your mind, because over the next 20 years, the wealthiest are set to inherit roughly $30 trillion. That is a ton of money, so presumably they would also pay a lot in taxes, right? Check this out. Let's assume that someone was to make $30 trillion in a single year's worth of income. I know it's crazy, but go with me on this one. Maybe their foot game is really strong on OnlyFans. Either way, they made a single $30 trillion year, right? In that case, depending on where they live and which state, they could pay over $15 trillion of that income in taxes. That's over 50%. Now, if they were to have a portfolio worth $30 trillion that they sold, they'd pay less, roughly 20% in capital gains taxes. That means they could pay as much as $6 trillion. But the wealthy will pay neither of those. They are estimated to pay only $4.2 trillion. That's because a person can send up to $12.9 million to a beneficiary during life or death, but a wealthy family could transfer an inheritance worth up to $26 million without having to pay federal estate taxes. Anything more than that would be taxed at 40%, but as long as it's below that ridiculously high number, then it's all good. But that's not even the mind-blowing part. The crazy part is that this federal estate exemption tax in 2001 was only $675,000. So in the span of 20 years or so, which is considered to be about a generation, 20 to 30 years worth, that number has almost 20x'd. That's a growth of 1,811%. That's fascinating that such a unique provision of the tax code has been updated so significantly throughout the years when other, far more arguably important monetary issues have stayed relatively flat, like people's incomes and the minimum wage, which has stayed the same since 2009. But overall, the effect of the wealth transfer will be good for millennials, which stand to increase their share of the wealth over the coming decades. Obviously, the ones who stand to benefit the most from this are of course the wealthiest, which is why there's going to be relatively little in taxes collected as a result. But this of course has caused a ton of debate and a ton of discussion between the two different classes of people over why this is happening and what we can do about it. On one side of the fence, we have people arguing for redistributing the wealth by increasing taxes on the wealthy and the corporations, and someone like Bernie Sanders is wanting to tax the billionaires at a 100% tax rate for those making over $1 billion a year. And they also want to get rid of something called the stepped up cost basis. Now, on the opposite side of the fence, we have those that are in favor for allowing the wealthy and the corporations to have their tax breaks and their tax havens, because the argument is to not have those would cause what's called a flight of capital, meaning the wealthy would hide their money somewhere else around the world, which would ultimately hurt the middle class. So those are the two sides, and I'd love to hear which side of the fence you're on. But here's arguably the most interesting statistic that I was able to find that everyone agrees on. This was conducted by a Bank of America survey where they asked a couple of interesting questions, like what is the definition of a life well lived? They asked over 3,000 people ages 55 and older across all types of wealth, and 94% said having friends and family that love me is that definition. 75% said to leave an impact on society, only 27% said being successful in their career, and only 10% said saving a ton of money. Now, when those same people were asked what they wanted to be remembered for across all of the different wealth statuses, the majority said they wanted to be remembered for the memories they've shared with loved ones. Virtually none of them wanted to be remembered for the amount of money they accumulated and left behind. So it seems at the tail end of our lives, money becomes the least important metric to care about. Now, up until this point in the video, I've given you all the data that I was able to find about this topic, and I usually never give my opinions about this, but I have a lot of personal thoughts. So if you made it this far into the video, here's what I think. I grew up in a very poor time and place, back in the USSR, back when my family never had any money growing up. They still technically don't, but they used to not have any either. Mitch Hedberg. Anyway, the point is that I'm not gonna inherit any money from my parents. And I remember rudely realizing that when I was trying to find a college to go to, and I was really angry with them because they didn't leave me with any money, while some of my friends went off to college out of state and they had a lot of fun. But I think my parents gave me something that was so much more valuable. Because we were a traveling circus family and I was a circus kid, I went to a lot of different countries really early on in my life, and I was exposed to a lot of different cultures, people of different ethnic backgrounds, and people of different financial means. And because of that, I never had a very strong identity of self, and I didn't have a strong perception and opinion about the world because I never stayed in the same place for very long. And that ultimately became a good thing because it made me really curious. Why was the world so different from each other? Why are some people the haves and why are some people the have-nots? Those are some of the questions I had when I was a little kid. And that curiosity eventually led me to, I think, finding out the answer to that question, which is not gonna make any sense to you right now. The answer to that question is, everyone's opinion matters. Everyone's opinion is ultimately justified, and it's just as valuable even when it's wrong. If you have an opinion, chances are millions of other people will believe it too. You see, unlike my parents, I was able to accumulate a subjectively substantial amount of wealth for my age range and across all ages, but that's purely thanks to YouTube and you watching my videos. And I realized something about having money that I don't know that I knew before having it. And what I realized is that success does not come at the expense of others. Just because someone is wealthy or ultra wealthy does not mean there is now all of the sudden less money to go around. Just because someone is successful does not mean they somehow contributed to lowering the odds for my own success. So circling back to the answer that opinions matter, if you believe that rich people are to blame, you are 100% right. And anyone can make a dozen YouTube videos with dramatic music justifying and validating that opinion. That information is all across the internet. That opinion will make you feel really warm and fuzzy inside. It'll make you feel good, but it will come at the expense of your own growth. I realized that if I instead flipped the script and I had a different opinion, maybe I used that time to learn a more valuable skill set or apply the skills I already knew, maybe reinvented myself from magic video editor guy to a finance guy on YouTube. Maybe if I allowed myself to fail, that I could somehow maybe someday succeed. And I started to invest in the stock market, and it didn't make me feel comfortable. Felt like a rigged game for the rich, but I did it anyway. And somehow kind of worked. I guess it all circles back to that quote I know you've heard of before from Henry Ford. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.